Indian town. Burned it to the ground. Just a few years later, then they built right back into ashes, and then in 1830, this church building was built. It originally was built right close down to the ground. In 1920, they raised it up, added these steps, went back up again, and added all this educational facility up underneath. They did maintain the original siding, the original appearance of the building, typical meeting house style building with the two front doors. Men went in the right, women went in on the left. And but they just jacked it up and did a lot of renovation to it in 1920, but have maintained the basic strong appearance of this meeting house style church. Again, we're working on the Presbyterians. Presbyterian, again, use their pulpit to promote the patriotism, and this is exactly what happened to Waxhaw Church. The Pastor Tarleton, the Beaufort Massacre, April 29th, 1780. Tarleton had 270 men, and they attacked 319 patriots, killed 115, wounded 151, took 53 prisoners. The 151 wounded were taken to Waxhaw. They opened up Waxhaw Church and used it as a hospital. Once Tarleton found out that they were using it for a hospital, he immediately went, removed everyone from the church, all the injured, and burned the church. Because again, they were aiding the patriots, and they needed to put a stop to it. Again, all this is fueling the fire for the patriots. They just could not continue to allow the British to run over them. So the more churches they burned, the harder the patriots fought for our own freedom. We also have some other noteworthy people that's connected to Waxhaw Church. Andrew Jackson was baptized here, our 7th president, and also his mother and father are buried at Waxhaw Graveyard. I've used the word graveyard several times. Anybody know the difference between a graveyard and a cemetery? This is a graveyard because it's attached to and belongs to a church. You may have Westview, you may have Magnolia Cemetery in your hometown, but if it's not a church that owns it or attached to it, it's a cemetery. Most people use the word graveyard and cemetery interchangeably, but if you want to get technical, there is a difference, and that is the difference in the fact that it's owned by a church. But it is a very large graveyard there in Lancaster County. Rocky Creek Presbyterian Church. Rocky Creek, no, there's nothing left of it. It's all gone. It was burned primarily because of the preacher. When Reverend William Martin found out about Waxhaw being burned, just as quick as he could get to the pulpit, he starts preaching about we need to pick up arms, we need to do our part. And that's again where the British start to have a problem, is when they're preached against from the pulpit of a dissenter church. So a Lieutenant Turnbull was sent out to disperse the congregation, and he took disperse to mean burn. And that's exactly what he did. He got everybody out of the church. He burned Rocky Creek Presbyterian Church, went to Reverend Martin's house, burned his house, and took Reverend Martin prisoner. And he stayed in prison for the duration of the Revolutionary War, just because he would not get back to a pulpit and preach against the British again. There are conflicting stories. You think St. Mark's is hard to find. Rocky Creek was a log building originally, and now 200 years later we're trying to find the remains of burned logs in a forest of trees. It's just, you can't do it. There are some groups, there is a group that tells us it's in one place. There's another group that says it's where the graveyard is. I kind of tend to think it's where the graveyard is. What better place to have a church than at a graveyard? And this is their graveyard, so I think it's here. And we explain a good bit of the difference in our book. But it was an interesting search to try to find Rocky Creek. When Reverend Martin got out of jail, got out of prison, he was able to come back to the area, and he went back to preaching. While he was preaching, he was able to acquire about 650 acres of land, and when he died in 1807, he was buried on his land. But a good Presbyterian preacher always visits his congregation and visits them very, very regularly. And when he got to his congregation's home, they would always offer him a sip of Irish whiskey. And it was awful hard for him to turn it down, and so he stayed for long visits. And some of his congregation, finally, he did admit having a problem. He was asked to resign, and he did stop preaching due to intemperance. Even though he kind of died in disgrace because of that, particularly in the Chesterfield area, the Lancaster area, he did a tremendous amount of work to support the cause for patriotism among his Presbyterian Scotch-Irish members. And this is where he's buried. The book tells you exactly how you can get there. If you really want to go to his grave, follow the directions exactly, because it is literally in the middle of the woods. St. Stephen's, opposite St. George Parish Church. The town of Dorchester was, it's all gone. Fort Dorchester is there, and this church tower is the only thing that remains of what once was the third largest city or community in South Carolina. It was a very well laid out town with this church, St. George Parish Church, and then they also had a fort there. There's another church right near here, the White Meeting House, which was also burned during the American Revolution. And but this is all that's left of that. When Colonel Wade Hampton and Nathaniel Greene started moving into the area and moving the British out, again, out of retaliation, there was even though this was an Anglican church, there was nothing stored in it, there was no real resentment, just out of pure hatred, the British burned the entire town of Dorchester. And this is all that's left. The tower, of course, is where the vestibule was. The entrance was right on the front side. When you came through these doors, you went into the main nave, which was built here. It was a very large brick building. They burned it completely out. After the Revolutionary War, most of the town of Dorchester pretty much evacuated and moved to Georgia. And so the only thing that was left was the church of any significance, of any value, and it was a burned out shell. Some rice plantation owners in the mid-1800s tried to restore it. I think it was a forest fire in 1825 that stopped that process of trying to restore it. Then the earthquake of 1886 came through, and the brick that was still standing were all just pretty much demolished. And brick was taken away piece by piece, and it was known as the brickyard for a long time. In the late 1900s, I guess the park recreation group stabilized this tower with a concrete cap on it, and so it's left there as a monument to St. George Church. But it's right near Dorchester Fort. Another church that's a brickyard is Biggins Church, just outside of Monk's Corner. The church was built in 1761 and then burned very shortly after that in 1781 as British troops were retreating out of Monk's Corner, heading towards Charleston. They were trying to get out as quickly as they could, so they had all this extra gunpowder and ammunition, so they put it inside of Biggins Church, and before they left, they set it on fire so it would not fall into, at that time, Thomas Sumter and Light Horse Harry Lee were doing the pushing of the British, getting them out. And so they certainly did not want it to fall into their hands. So they put everything they owned, gunpowder-wise, in the church and set it on fire and burned the church. It was restored later, and then a forest fire came through in 1880 and destroyed it again, and hasn't been built back since. Again, the earthquake of 1886 did a lot of damage. There's only 2 walls standing there now. But there's a lot to be seen and a lot to be learned about early 1700, mid 1700 construction. These are coin corners. Today we see those on houses purely as decoration. These were put here structurally to reinforce the corners. Even though our walls are 24 inches thick, here you can see a good example of how the wall and brick are woven together. This is what we call a header course. This would be a brick that you would see that looks like a half brick on the front. This is a stretcher brick. It goes 8 inches down the wall. And so every other brick are woven together through these 24 inches of thick brick wall. This is a water table situation. This wall is 24 inches thick here. Down at the foundation is 32 inches thick. Then they handmade these shapes of brick. So as the water came down the wall, it was allowed to roll over this rather than pocketing right here and creating a problem with freezing and thawing in the wintertime and deteriorating the brick. Again, today we see these purely as aesthetic decorations, but here they served a real purpose in the fact of this water table to shed the water off the thicker wall down below it. Presbyterian Meeting House over in Camden. There's nothing left of this building now. That the graveyard is here. Jim Neal, the guy that I work with on this book, he and I were a little bit on odds as to include this building or not. But obviously the British did occupy Camden, and this particular church was taken by the British when they moved into Camden. It was physically torn apart and used to build barracks. When the British moved out of Camden in May of 1781, again in defeat and out of anger, they burned most all of Camden. There are very few buildings left standing in what is not downtown Camden today, but out of where the Revolutionary War Park is. That's where this Presbyterian cemetery graveyard is, and also the Quaker graveyard is out at the Revolutionary Park of the original Camden. But my feeling was, again, that the Presbyterian church was torn apart by the British and then later burned, even though it was a barracks. My take on it is that it was still destroyed in the demolition of it by the British. Thus, we did include it. Now, the Quaker church, which probably was burned in Camden, Quakers are very quiet, very private group of people, just never could find anything in print and in record to say that the Quaker church was burned. But it probably was burned. This is another view of where the graveyard is. The church would be in this view over to the right. It was a wood frame building, very easily taken apart. I do want to leave you with the thought as we look at St. Andrew's Church, St. Andrew's Parish Church, which is the oldest church in South